Why hello and welcome to another video, another adventure in Australian literature, though we're doing something a bit different than we normally do because we're looking at a piece of non-fiction today rather than a piece of Australian fiction. But before we start, remember there is our shop where we have books and writing services. We should have a new book coming up in the next few weeks. We also have our Redbubble shop, which has over 100 designs on it. So if you want to support us, that's how you can support us. Also, please like, subscribe, comment and share. All of those things help support us in making videos. So, what are we looking at today? Today, we are looking at David Marr's Killing for Country. This has been sitting on my bookcase for a year. It came out around this time last year, so it's about 10 months it's been sitting on my bookcase. Now, this is history, and I would like, before we start, to offer a trigger warning to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples watching this video. We are talking about the frontier wars, and I fully understand if you would like to opt out of this video before we go any further. So while I have no intention to be particularly graphic, I understand that this material is deeply upsetting for people. I cannot say that that excludes myself. This is probably the most distressing book I've ever read. It's certainly the hardest book I've ever read. So I fully understand if you choose not to watch this video. We have tons of other videos on the channel, so please avail yourself of one of those. So if you are still here, we're looking at Killing for Country. Before we start, I think it's probably a good idea to tell you who David Marr is. Now, David Marr is a Walkley Award-winning journalist. He's probably one of the most distinguished journalists in Australia, working in Australia at this time. He is a biographer. He has written many quarterly essays, most of which focus on prominent politicians. I believe he's written one about Pauline Hanson and One Nation. He's written one about Tony Abbott that was republished as a book. He's written about, I think it was, he's written about Kevin Rudd, and he's written about Bill Shorten, I believe. He's also written about George Pell, and he has written about the Henson case. If you don't know anything about the Henson case, I'll leave a link to somewhere to give you an idea about that. So he is has a formidable reputation in Australia. He is one of the few journalists whose work I actually seek out to read. I like his work. He is an incredibly readable journalist, but mostly his reputation is built on the absolutely stunning biography he wrote of Patrick White. Big biography, exhaustive, and written with the cooperation and aid of Patrick White himself. After Patrick White's death, he also edited the letters of Patrick White. So that is the pedigree of the author of this book. Okay, he is an extraordinarily good writer with an extraordinary pedigree. This book came out of seeking in his family history for information about his great-grandmother's father, Reginald And one of the things that he found when he started researching was Reginald in the uniform of the native police. And that led to this book. Now, this book, the native police were a paramilitary force. Now, I am going to say I did not know really much about this until I read this book. They're a paramilitary force. They used dispossessed indigenous people as the ground troops with white officers to basically to commit genocide, to commit what were euphemistically called dispersals, to kill indigenous people and clear the land for pastoralists, squatters. It's not a good part of our history. Now, that's distressing enough to discover. What this book goes on to discuss is it begins not with the native police initially, but it begins much, much, much earlier in New South Wales, when New South Wales was a much smaller colony, and when squatters were pushing for more land to break out of what was considered, here is the limits of the colony, and we don't push beyond that. But this is where the squatters, seeking to make money out of the sheep, were pushing out into the Liverpool Plains, and obviously their presence in the Liverpool Plains caused conflict with the indigenous peoples living there, which resulted in violence, because you can't move into someone's territory without causing violence. You can't dispossess people of their land and expect them not to fight back. The first two sections of this book is in 3 sections. The first section is looking at how the interactions between the wealthy squatters and the government worked, how killing on the frontier was normalized and accepted. And the second section looks at the forming of the native police, how this widespread, and it was widespread, killing on the frontier led to the development of what is essentially a paramilitary force. And then the third section relates mostly to Darcy and Reg Ear's careers in the native police. So it's quite a tough book. I have read this over the course of about 3 days. I've actually found the third part of the book the easiest to read, which was probably, I say it was the easiest to read, and it was because it was focused more on Reg and Darcy, which I'm sure for David Marr was probably part of the hardest to read, to actually see the killing of members of his own family. So what made this hard? What made this hard? Part of the issue, I think, for most Australians is we labour under a silence. We labour under a silence that has been allowed to persist for well over 200 years. Yes, we knew that, the settlement was not a peaceful settlement, that there was violence. But Australian history, for the majority of people, goes something like this. Convicts, Rum Rebellion, over the Blue Mountains, wars in Bathurst, gold, sheep, gold again in Victoria, Eureka Stockade, Ned Kelly, Federation, World War I, the Depression, Don Bradman, Phar Lap, World War II, migrants, the Olympics, we lost a PM, Gough Whitlam, dismissal, Vietnamese boat people, Olympics again. It's pretty slim, and it's certainly fairly self-congratulatory. Fairly self-congratulatory is an understatement. It's very self-congratulatory. So what does this shallow, self-congratulatory understanding of our own history mean? Well, I studied Australian history at university. And most of the stuff in the first 2 sections of this book was new to me. I will admit that I studied at university quite some time ago, but most of this is new to me. We don't do a lot of colonial Australian history. And a lot of this history had not been really researched at the time. A lot of this history was still sitting in the archives, in primary sources, when David Marr has dug it up to write this book. Okay? A lot of this stuff is coming from the primary sources and being examined for the first time, not just by someone like David Marr, but by other people now. This is 21st century Australian history. This is not the history that we were taught. So, reading this, I honestly felt deeply, deeply ashamed. I felt deeply, deeply ashamed. Partly about what had been done, the violence that had been done is deeply shameful. The violence being winked at by the state, because Australia has a unique legal problem when it came to negotiating with, engaging with its indigenous inhabitants from the word go. There are 2 legal fictions that really created a nightmare situation. The first was terra nullius, the imagined idea that this country was empty and belonged to no one, while it was patently obvious when Cook declared Australia terra nullius, which he did on Possession Island, which was uninhabited, he was patently aware from his engagement with indigenous peoples during the voyage of exploration that there were indigenous peoples here, that there were people here, and possession is 9/10 of the law, is it not? So therefore, if they were on the land, I think it was theirs. But it was a convenient fiction to say, no, it belongs to nobody. Using the, well, we didn't see any evidence of cultivation, we didn't see any evidence of boundaries put up, so therefore it belongs to nobody. This was a problem. This has been a problem. This was only overturned in the late 20th century with the Marr decision and Wick. That has occurred in my lifetime, the overturning of terra nullius. That occurred in the 1990s. The second issue that caused a great deal of this violence was the declaration that indigenous peoples in Australia were subjects of the king. If they didn't belong to the country, and the country didn't belong to them, then they were subjects of the king. And one does not make treaties with one's own subjects. So what you have is legal fictions that disenfranchised and dispossessed indigenous people of their lands. That's a problem. Now, London had always been officially saying the indigenous people are to be treated with care. They are to be considered with blah, blah, blah. And I say blah, blah, blah because it really was lip service. This is an official way of saying, well, we're not responsible for this because we had these orders. But when the laws are on the books and are not enforced, are they even laws? This book really highlights how if you don't enforce a law, it's not a law. It doesn't count. Now, why were these laws allowed to not count? Why were colonial governments so weak that they did not stand up for the rights of people who were decreed to be under their protection? Money and threats, the threats that money brought. The fact that these squatters had very powerful backers back in England, the fact that any act on the part of any governor was generally met with whining and writing of letters back to England in order to get your own way, to dismiss a governor, to push in, we want this and we're going to keep complaining about this until we get our own way. We will have people dismissed from posts using our powerful backers in England to get our own way. The absolute spinelessness of the colonial authorities allowed this to happen. The absolute spinelessness to investigate and to call murder murder is what allowed this to happen. Now, one of the things that is always held up as, oh well, were the colonial authorities completely complicit in this, is the prosecution of the killers at Myall Creek, which is in northern New South Wales. Which I didn't realise, like this is how scant I think a lot of our teaching of colonial history is that I didn't realise Myall Creek was occurred in the 1830s. I actually thought it was later. So this is a problem. We don't have this really good picture of this world, and it's our own country. Why? Because it's so shameful to look at it. And shame is one of those incredibly powerful emotions because it hits ego. Shame says you are not who you think you are. And it behooves us to look past the shame and press on and continue the book. This is a book that does make you feel ashamed. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You should feel ashamed, and the other one was betrayed. So the Mile Creek Massacre was unique because it was a prosecution. It was a prosecution, and I think in the way that it has been taught, the way that it has been talked about, it implies, the implication has been, oh, well, there was a prosecution and that stopped the frontier killing. No, that didn't stop the frontier killing. That drove the frontier killing underground. It meant that people in frontier places didn't kill with guns, they killed with poison, where it was much harder to catch people, and silence closed in around the killers. The killers were powerful men. These were powerful families who held a lot of people's livelihoods in their hands. It was very hard to find people who would speak out against these men, and they knew it. And that is part of the reason why the killing continued. Now, yes, this is something that will make you feel not great. And it will make you question things about, oh, well, what is this? What am I living with? Where am I living? What is the history? What is the legacy of this? And I certainly felt that reading this book. It's what makes this book so incredibly powerful. But it's not just a story of a country ruled by greed and spinelessness. It's certainly, the greed and the spinelessness certainly explain certain things about the stranglehold money has over politics to this day in this country. But this is also a book about the other voices that were speaking up, the people who were saying this is wrong, the people who were writing to premiers, to governors, to say this is happening, this is wrong, this is causing more disturbance in our area than needs to be caused. That is something that I think that every person can cling on to and say, yes, we are not our worst, because we weren't our worst. The fact that the voices to the contrary to the violence were not enough to stop it is incredibly disappointing. But at the same time, money and power are formidable things to come up against. The fact that decent people's voices were raised at all is something to hang on to as you read this book. I'd actually like to add one little quote from the back of the book that I think sums up a great deal about this work. This is a work not to go in lightly. It is a work where I think the people who are going to read this book are people for whom it's not going to be a terrible, it's not going to be the worst surprise. That it's not going to be read with people who are denialists, people who deny the violence. But it's also not a book to go into and think, oh, this will be a an easy read. No, this is legitimately, I think, the hardest thing I've ever read. I've read about gulags in Russia. I have read about so many historical things where people have had horrible things happen to them. And yet when it's put on your own doorstep, it's put here and this is the history of your own country, it's so much harder to read. It's so much harder to read because it does challenge who are we as a people? And do we want to be those people still? Anyway, from the back of this, what began as an account of the bloody exploits of the brothers turned into a history of an invasion in which they were foot soldiers. I was drawn into the worlds of sheep, money, merchants, the press, the church, the law, and London's imperial cowardice. I was intrigued by the shadowy form of today's politics emerging from the frontier wars, particularly the still potent belief in many quarters that Aboriginal people deserve nothing for the continent they lost. Polls show hostility is strongest where most blood was shed. Despising those we have wronged is another way we humans have of dealing with our shame. And I think that really does sum up a lot of how this book makes you feel. This isn't a book designed to make you feel guilty. That is, I think, probably the most powerful thing about this. He never once does David Marr accuse contemporary Australia of being guilty of this. But also, because this is as much a history as a family history, and because David Marr is a journalist, he doesn't refrain from choosing a side. And the side that he chooses is not the side that perpetrated the violence. He leaves you in no doubt that this side, the side of violence, was monstrous and evil and caused an appalling amount of harm, which is continuing to resonate today. Until I read this book, I did not fully accept the word genocide with Indigenous Australians, because surely it wasn't that bad. Reading this book and seeing the blind eye that the governments paid, the systematic and deliberate institutionalised violence against Indigenous people, yeah, genocide is the appropriate word for that. The fact that this genocide failed to extinguish the Indigenous people of this country is something that we have to be grateful for. The fact that they, as a people, have endured in spite of our violence. So, absolutely a book to look at if you have the courage to do so, which I do hope people do. It is part of bearing witness is important, no matter how painful it is. And that's where I'd like to leave you. I am going, after reading this, to go and read some John Clarke. I have his book Tinkerings, and I think I need that. So I'm going to leave you here today, and I'm going to bring something much lighter and much easier to read next time. So until then, goodbye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.